Morning, everyone. House Democrats remain ready, willing, and able, as we've repeatedly made clear from the beginning of this Congress, to work with our Republican colleagues to solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers. The only way that things will be done in this Congress, as has been consistently demonstrated through every major issue we have been asked to confront, is in bipartisan fashion. For the life of me, it's strange that my Republican colleagues refuse in the House to process that lesson and continue to move partisan bills designed to advance a right-wing ideology that have zero chance of ever being passed into law. Should not play partisan political games with America's national security. We should not play partisan political games in the context of the special relationship between the United States and Israel. Should not play partisan political games as it relates to our necessary effort to support the Ukrainian valiant, courageous, and brave stand against Russian aggression. We should not play partisan political games as it relates to the need to provide humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians who may be in harm's way in Gaza through no fault of their own. The time for extreme MAGA Republican partisanship is over. The time for extreme MAGA Republican brinksmanship is over. The time for extreme MAGA Republican gamesmanship is over. It's time to do the business of the American people and the free world. Questions?
Leader, despite intense whipping by Democrats, there were 12 of your own that sided with Republicans last night. Can you just respond to that? Were you disappointed?
The overwhelming majority of House Democrats opposed the partisan political stunt that was put on the floor by my Republican colleagues, unnecessarily conditioning aid to Israel, which has never been done during Israel's 75 years of existence and the special relationship that has existed between our two countries. It's never been done. And there was no rational reason for it to have occurred. And so our objective from the very beginning was to back President Biden, who made clear that he would veto the irresponsible bill put forward by House Republicans. We made it clear that that veto would be sustained, not just marginally, but decisively, if it ever made it back to the House, which it will not.
Yeah. So what's your view on what seems like some growing disagreement among Democrats about sort of some of the tactical ways Israel is handling this war, whether it's people calling for a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause? There seems to be a lot more criticism coming from Democrats about sort of the nuts and bolts of how Israel is handling this every day. And what's your view on that?
I wouldn't say it's criticism. I'd say there are different observations or perspectives about the best way forward, but all of it coming from, as far as I can tell, a place of care and concern related to Israel's safety and its well-being. Everybody seems to recognize that Israel necessarily has to decisively defeat Hamas. Period, full stop. Clearly, that's my perspective. Now, I think there are three things that need to occur simultaneously to the greatest extent possible. One, Israel has to decisively defeat the terrorist organization Hamas and rid them from the region for the good of Israel, for the good of America, for the good of the free world, for the good of the democratic aspirations of the Palestinian people. Second, we need to do everything possible to secure the release of the hostages. Israeli hostages, American hostages, international hostages. Third, we need to urgently make sure we are providing humanitarian assistance and relief to Palestinian civilians who are in harm's way, as happens in war through no fault of their own. Those are the three objectives. And I think the Biden administration will continue to communicate closely with the Israeli government to figure out the best way to accomplish those three critical objectives.
Thanks, Mr. Leader. In the other chamber, there's consideration for possible changes to border policy and asylum laws that's happening between both sides. If that is the cost for aid to Israel and to Ukraine, and it potentially doesn't have anything for DACA, is that something, how would your conference respond to something like that?
Well, the president submitted a comprehensive request for supplemental funding connected to America's national security priorities. That includes support for Israel, support for Ukraine, support for our allies in the Indo-Pacific, support for America's own military readiness, support for humanitarian assistance for civilians who are in harm's way, and for supporting the effort to strengthen our border. And so I think to the extent that there are bipartisan discussions in the Senate related to a comprehensive approach to meeting the national security needs of America and our allies throughout the world in a manner consistent with our values, then we'll look at any bipartisan product that comes out of the Senate in good faith, which is very different than extreme MAGA Republicans putting on the House floor legislation that they know is dead on arrival in the Senate, that they know will be vetoed by President Biden, and that they know we will be unable to override that veto, as House Democrats decisively demonstrated yesterday. The time for gamesmanship is over. What do my Republican colleagues not get about that? The world is on fire. We have real challenges here in America as we're trying to keep the great American middle-class dream alive for people all across the land. And it's my hope that my Republican colleagues, who only represent barely half of 1/3 of the federal government, will come to the conclusion that the only way forward is to find bipartisan common ground.
Back to yesterday, those 12 Democrats, I know you said a majority of Democrats obviously voted against the measure.
Overwhelming majority.
Overwhelming majority. But House Democrats so often say their unity is their strength. Are you concerned after intense whipping from the White House and from you losing those 12? It concerns you about unity amongst the caucus?
No, because my Republican colleagues were openly speculating that we were going to lose 50, 60, 70 Democrats and put in jeopardy the notion that a veto by President Biden could be sustained. Take it.
Two groups, Democrats for Democratic majority for Israel and mainstream Democrats have been critical or are considering primarying some of the progressive critics of Israel, Representative Tlaib, Representative Bush. What do you think of those of that stance, and would that be a good use of donors' money in your mind to primary those people?
Outside groups are going to do what outside groups are going to do. I think House Democrats are going to continue to support each other.
Thank you. So yesterday, one of the 5 officers in the Tyree Nichols case pleaded guilty to his involvement in Nichols' death. Following that announcement, the NAACP, they issued a statement saying it's time for Congress to step up and enact the federal reforms necessary to prevent future cases of police brutality. What's your response?
Well, in the previous Congress, in fact, in the previous two Congresses, House Democrats have led the effort to try to get comprehensive police reform measures enacted into law as part of our view that we've got to strike the right balance between public safety, strengthening the relationship between law enforcement and the community, and avoiding to the greatest extent possible and eliminating police brutality in America. We still believe that there's an urgent need to move that legislation forward. We are under no illusions as it relates to the willingness of extreme MAGA Republicans in the House to do anything to strengthen the relationship between the police and communities of color throughout America. It is my hope that the conversations that were bipartisan in nature earlier in the Congress, in the Senate, will resume at some point, led by Cory Booker. Thanks.
Government funding runs out in 2 weeks from today. How concerned are you about a government shutdown?
The American people should be very concerned that the extreme MAGA Republicans have made a decision once again to try to shut down the government. This notion of a so-called laddered CR, like the novelty, being delicate with my words here, the novelty of my friends on the other side of the aisle in terms of how they come up with language that disguise their intentions. Translation, they want to shut the government down. Because many of my Republican colleagues fundamentally do not believe in a functional federal government which is designed to meet the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people. They're not interested in a functional federal government. How do we know that? Because for the last 25 plus years, Republicans, largely led in the House, have repeatedly shut the government down. It was my hope that under new management, there would be a different approach, and that remains to be seen what will happen in advance of November 17th. But let's be clear. The only way forward is in a bipartisan way to pass a continuing resolution at the fiscal 2023 level. We are not going to allow Republicans to try to impose right-wing cuts that devastate and undermine the health, the safety, or the economic well-being of the American people because they are unable to achieve their policy directives outside of threatening a government shutdown. We have never paid a Republican ransom note in the context of their threats to shut the government down. We've always stood on the side of the American people, and we will continue to do that in advance of November 17th and beyond.
The President and some members of your party have called for a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire in the conflict in Gaza. Do you support a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire?
As I mentioned to Garrett, there are three things that need to be done simultaneous to each other. First, Israel must decisively defeat Hamas. Second, we must make sure that we do everything possible to bring the hostages home safely. Third, we have to urgently provide humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians who are in harm's way through no fault of their own. How that is managed logistically, I will leave to President Biden, the Biden administration, the Israeli government, the Egyptian government, the UN, and all of the other actors in the region to work out. Thanks. Fatima?
Are you open to splitting the different aspects of the emergency supplemental if Republicans are willing to find a different way to pay for them or just pass them cleanly?
Well, emergency funding is, by definition, the result of a domestic or international emergency. And part of the problem with the extreme MAGA Republican legislation yesterday was that for the first time, they were trying to condition aid to Israel, even though the horrific events of October 7th fall into the classic definition of an emergency. Brutal atrocities resulting in more than 1,400 Israelis slain is an emergency. Israel's sovereignty being violated by hundreds, if not thousands, of Hamas terrorists who crossed into southern Israel unexpectedly is an emergency. A war of necessity in terms of the conflict with Hamas is the classic definition of emergency. Russia invading Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since the end of World War II, is an emergency. And so many of us are perplexed at the decision that was made by Republicans to abandon the approach that has been taken in a bipartisan way to respond to emergencies and try to politicize it by imposing a condition in their legislation that was designed to undermine the Inflation Reduction Act. That is a classic definition of a political stunt. With respect to the product that leaves the Senate, which will necessarily be bipartisan, when it comes over to the House in whatever form, we're prepared to consider it in good faith.
Even if it's divided?
We're prepared to consider it in good faith. We'll have to examine what the particulars are when it comes over to us. Kevin?
Mayor Adams was supposed to meet at the White House and here on Capitol Hill yesterday, backed out of those amid questions about an FBI raid on his campaign treasurer's house. I'm curious, one, were you supposed to be in any of those meetings? And two, are you confident that he can balance working on something such as the migrant situation, which is why he was supposed to be here, with ongoing legal questions about his campaign?
Yes.
Both?
Yes to both. Yes to both.
President Biden and the First Lady will be visiting Maine today to grieve with the families who were affected by the recent mass shooting. I'm curious, there's been some discharge petitions that you all put forward. Is there any action coming from House Democrats that you expect? Have you spoken to Speaker Johnson about any gun safety measures that can make it to the floor? And have you spoken with Congressman Golden since he changed his position on the assault weapons ban? Now he supports it. I'm curious, have you had any conversations with Congressman Golden since the shooting took place?
I've spoken to Speaker Johnson about a variety of issues earlier this week, but we did not talk about the urgent need to address the gun violence epidemic in America, though I certainly plan to have that discussion with him sooner rather than later. I've also talked to Congressman Golden. I'll let him characterize his position. I think he did it in a very heartfelt, authentic, and public way. What is clear to me is that the status quo in America is unacceptable. Tens of thousands of lives lost each and every year to gun violence. No other advanced economy in the country has this problem. Canada doesn't have this type of gun violence problem. Australia doesn't have this type of gun violence problem. Great Britain doesn't have this type of gun violence problem. France doesn't have this kind of gun violence problem. Japan doesn't have this kind of gun violence problem. Germany doesn't have this kind of gun violence problem. Like, we clearly have to address it. The status quo is not acceptable. We have to crush the gun violence epidemic. Cannot have weapons of war flooding our communities that are not designed to hunt deer. They are designed to shred children. Something must be done. And as House Democrats, we want to do it in a bipartisan way, in whatever form that takes. Thanks.
Back to Ukraine. Would you be open at all to immigration policy changes tied to Ukraine?
We'll have to take a look at what emerges from the Senate in a bipartisan fashion, what the White House may be comfortable with in terms of discussions about strengthening our border in a manner that is consistent with two principles. First, our heritage as a nation of immigrants. Second, a nation anchored in the rule of law. And from my standpoint, those will be the two lenses through which the House Democratic Caucus will evaluate any legislation connected to the border that is sent over to us from the United States Senate.
So you would be open to that?
I'm open to having a good faith discussion about anything that has the possibility of securing bipartisan support. Last question, thanks.
Back on Ukraine and Israel, the Republicans seem to be making a distinction about the urgency of help for Israel in comparison with the urgency of help for Ukraine. But both countries have seen their citizens tortured, murdered, raped in horrific numbers. Is there, in your mind, any reason to make a distinction between these victims of atrocities between these two countries?
Well, we must continue to urgently stand with Israel and recognize that Israel has a unique place in the world as a Jewish and democratic state and a homeland for the Jewish people. The only one that exists in a very dangerous world in the context of centuries of the Jewish people being ejected from countries, subjected to pain and persecution and pogroms, and of course the horrors of the Holocaust, an unthinkable crime against humanity, and then the challenges that the only Jewish state in the world faces now and has faced for the last 75 years. So, of course, we have to view the urgent need to stand with Israel through that very significant historical lens. We also need to make sure that we evaluate the importance of standing with Ukraine through the lens of brutal aggression in Europe and what that can lead to, as we saw horrifically in World War I and World War II, where tens of millions of people across the globe lost their lives, which is why we need to make sure that Ukraine is successful and that we can end the conflict there without an escalatory war that involves Western Europe, NATO, and if NATO is involved, by necessity, consistent with our Article 5 obligations, the United States of America. And so these are complex foreign policy issues that many of my Republican colleagues try to simplify. And you cannot simplify the dynamics of a very dangerous world. You can simplify some basic principles that we should continue to stand with our friends and allies in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and in the Indo-Pacific, consistent with the request that President Biden has submitted to the Congress, and we should consider that request in a bipartisan way for the good of America's national security interests and for the good of the world. Thank you, everyone.